Hi, my name is Nick Ryan. I'm an inbound product manager on the Data Foundations team. And today we're going to talk about a capability that was introduced in the Utah version of ServiceNow for integrating data into ServiceNow using the same mechanisms that we've used for quite a long time to build service graph connectors for populating the CMDB. But now that capability can be used for non-CMDB data as well. So we're going to set a foundation so everybody has the same understanding of what the IRE is and what Integration Hub ETL is, as these are the two features in ServiceNow that have been updated to allow non-CMDB data to be processed as well as of Utah. And then we're going to go through why this is important. We're going to talk about the import set API, which isn't specific to this particular type of integration, but it is useful if you want to have a push-based integration instead of a pull-based. And we're going to walk through building it out and talk about some things you can do as next steps. So first off, what is IRE? IRE is the identification and reconciliation engine in ServiceNow that's been used for a long time by our discovery product and by service graph connectors. And it drives uniqueness in the database for CIs, as well as lets you define precedence rules on multiple data sources updating the same data. And so it's very useful in terms of driving a high quality data set by enforcing uniqueness, and also allowing you to update that same data from multiple places without unintended overrides. So what is Integration Hub ETL? So as you would imagine, the important part of ETL has been around for a long time with extracting, transforming, and loading. And we're going to look at what this really means when we take a look at the demo. There are a number of out-of-the-box transforms options that we'll see some of when we go through the demo. But the big part is that at the end of the process in the loading step is that this Integration Hub ETL tool is really generating the payload that the IRE expects so that it can process it correctly into the system. So one point of clarification, because we get the question a lot, is there's Integration Hub and Integration Hub ETL. And what's the similarities? What's the difference? So just to break it down pretty simply, is that they are two completely separate products. Integration Hub has a lot of pre-built spokes and a lot of integrations into third-party systems, whereas Integration Hub ETL is really just a tool that is used to build data integrations and is commonly used by our service graph connector engineers to build service graph connectors. Now, Integration Hub ETL may use as its data source certain Integration Hub actions, but at the end of the day, Integration Hub on its own has its own licensing and its own product teams within ServiceNow and so on. And so just don't be confused by the naming convention there. All right. Now, why is it important, or why would it be useful to use the IRE and Integration Hub ETL for non-CMDB data? Well, one is to improve data quality. So locations are one of the things we're going to look at today. And historically, you may have multiple people or multiple systems with location data in it, and you want to improve the quality of your location data. Or maybe users is another one. And so you've got user data coming in from multiple sources, and you want to make sure that there's not duplicates in the system, or that certain data elements are not being overwritten. And another nice thing as we look at the ETL tool is that you'll see that there's some visual mappings in there of how the data is being processed. And so it can be a little bit easier to understand what's really happening in terms of the data transformations and how the source data gets to its ultimate destination and in its final state. And then the consistency factor is important from the perspective that you may already have people in your organization that know how to integrate data into the CMDB and use these tools already. And so being able to integrate other types of data in the same way can allow for an easier transition and understanding of the tooling. So there are some things to consider when we're talking about non-CMDB tables and being processed through the IRE. So this does only start working in Utah and later versions of ServiceNow. There is this system property that's controlling and limiting the tables that can use this capability, and the list is there. It is a system property, like I say, so you can add to it if you want to. And I believe we will be having plans in the future to removing this limitation, but being the initial release, we wanted to put some guardrails on this. And so there's no out-of-the-box identification rules for these tables either. So it's important to understand that out of the box, we are not prescribing what has to make these records unique for your organization. And we're going to walk through how to create these as well. I'm not going to read through this whole list, but these are some important things to know on what's supported versus not supported when it comes to comparing this with what you can do in the CMDB. I will say one of the biggest ones is that today most users will define identification rules through the class manager interface. That is not supported for these non-CMDB tables at this point, but we will look at how to do that. And so our first use case, or really the one we're going to look at today, is about locations. And so as we take a look at it here in a bit, we are working under some assumptions, and that's that we're going to load city and state information from the same file. So we have a single data source effectively, and we're going to create city and state information based on that. And so it's going to be in this hierarchy, like you see down at the bottom, where I've got like Alaska and then all the Alaska cities, Alabama, then all the Alabama cities, and so on. And what you see on the right is how we're going to define the identification rule. So we'll see where to go do that. But there's really two aspects to this. One is what makes a city unique, and then, or the base record for the location, which could be a city or a state. So what makes that unique? And then also, is there a dependency? So if I have ADAC Alaska, could I also have ADAC Alabama? And so that's what this related entry really is providing. And it's taking into account, all right, if there's a parent value on a location record, then take that into account when we're looking at uniqueness here, because it's a very valid situation that you may have the exact same city name in two different states or even in different countries and so on. So we will look at that as well. Talking about the type of integration, so it could be a pull, could be a push. We could just have a file that we want to upload here if we want. But I do want to expose this import set API that we're going to use, and this is going to allow us to create effectively a push-based integration so that updates can happen in pretty close to real time if that's the type of integration that you want. So there's a few steps in here. We're going to create our data source, load some sample data, creating the ETL definitions really doesn't have to happen straight away there, until you want to actually process the data all the way to its final destination in ServiceNow. We're going to use the insert multiple endpoint. Doesn't have to be. There is, you can send in data kind of one by one. I don't know why that would be really useful in large volumes, but so we're going to use the insert multiple endpoint when we look at that. I will say I've broken it out into just state by state loads, because if I try to load 200,000 cities all at the same time, I can tell you that it's going to error out on me. So I broke it down into smaller data sets here. All right, with that, let's jump in and take a look at the demo of this. So here we are on our location table. You can see there's not really any in here. There's maybe some old demo data, but we're going to want our data to have this location type, because that was part of our identification rule that we're going to define here in a second. This is that system property, and you can see here's the location table that we're going to be focused on in this list. But if you want to add a table that's not in here, then go ahead and add it at the end, separated by a comma. And one of the first things that we need to do is to create an identification rule, because again, there are none out of the box for these tables. So if I try to look up location, so there's this cloud location group, but that's a CI class we can see. So that's not the one we want. We actually want the location table itself. So we can click new here just to come up, and let's just call it locations. And then we will look for locations here. And it has to be independent. We don't yet support dependent non-CMDB tables in terms of the IRE. And I will say, while this is saving that record, that we're going to have to create a specific discovery source. And so it's, we'll talk about that in a second, but it's important to think about if you need one or multiple for your integration. So here on this first tab, we're going to specify the attributes that make this, this unique. We want to be on the location table still. That up, and here I want to have it as the name and the location type. And so what that is effectively saying is that I want to have the name value that I'm going to map to, as well as the location type. So again, if I have like a state in Alaska, and then a location type could be city, and maybe that's Alaska too. Those will be two different records because they have different types as far as that goes. And so I'll quickly show you too on the types. So these are the out-of-the-box location types. You can see that there's building or structures, or cities, countries, floors, regions, so on. We're just going to be worried about loading state/province data and city data. And so you could also set this value to allow null attribute, which means one of these could be blank. I don't want to do that here because I know that in my integration, I'm going to actually set both of these. But if you, for some reason, thought there might be a data source that wouldn't have the type, then you could say allow null, and it would still process, but just based on the name. Here we want to set that reference to the parent field because we want it to be able to take into account the fact that there may be multiple values for a specific child, but in the context of the parent, they are unique. So again, two states may have the same city name as an example. So we'll save that. this is really all it takes to create the identification rule here. So now we're ready to start loading data through the IRE because this particular table of location has an identification rule. So we're going to come back here and we'll go ahead and create a data source. So the data source is really going to define how we're going to load this data. So I'll go ahead and say click new here, and I'll call it just Acme. Well, let's just call it city because I know mostly this is going to be city data. And so what's important here actually is going to be this import set table name. So this is going to be important for our integration that we're going to push the data into. So here you could see just, attach a file and load it up through that, but I want this to happen more dynamically and ongoingly. So I'm going to go ahead and put it in JSON format, and we'll take a look at this format here in a bit, but and we'll understand why I'm putting these records in here like this when we take a look at the data here. But this is going to effectively start to set up the endpoint that I can push the data to. And at this point, it still hasn't created this table name. I actually need to load a bit of sample data. So I'm going to load in just a single example of the data and then click this test load 20 records. And what this will do at this point in time is actually go out and it's creating, as you see here, it's creating this table at this point in time when you do the very first load. So you need to do at least one load for it to go back to that, or for it to create this staging table name. And so I'm going to actually copy that, and over here in Postman, this is the endpoint that I'm going to send this to. And so here's my instance, and the import set API really works on this endpoint. So API now import, and then you give it your table name that you just created. And like I said, I like to use the insert multiple. And what that does is, and why I specified records when I was defining the data source, is because I have an array of records here. And so that's what's really tying the two together, is in that data source, we're getting a specific import set table and saying, hey, what's the trigger of records that need to be processed? And so this is really the format that you need to do, is make an array of objects of some sort, with it being a records array. And we're going to come back to this once we've processed or finished all the setup, but we're not ready to do that yet because we haven't defined our mappings or anything. And so one thing that we'll also need to do here is we're going to have to define a data source. And so usually what happens in these integrations, because you might move it from instance to instance after you've built it, is we're going to say I need to create a discovery source for locations. And so the script to do that is really, there's these script includes that are in the integration commons application. And so I'm just going to call it Acme location import. So that's what I'm going to call that for now. And what happens with these fixed scripts, if you haven't really used them before, is that the first time you install an application, you can see mine is in this Acme locations application. So I'm in a specific scope that I've created. But if I move this to another instance, the first time it installs, it's going to run this fixed script and create this discovery source for me. So I'm going to go ahead and run that here. Background, it's fine. And so now that I've got all that set up, I've got my identification rule, my discovery source is in place, my data source is in place, then what I can do is come into Integration Hub ETL and create a new definition here. So I'm going to give it a new application that I'm going to set up. And so this comes back now to that ETL steps that we talked about and all the things that are going to generate the IRE payload for us based on the mappings we define here. So the first time you do this, I'm going to say I want to add a new application. Again, we'll call it Acme locations. Hopefully my discovery source is in here. So yep, here it is, Acme location import. That's the one we just created in that fix script. And here I'm going to say Acme, we'll call this one cities, because I'm loading in cities. And I'll probably do states too. City and states, cities and states. And we can look for our, call it Acme. Well, it is Acme cities. That was our data source. Pull in a new one so we can see some data. All right, good. We should get some sample data because we did actually execute that data source, I thought. That's pretty good. All right, so here was that single sample record that I had in that file that we attached. And so there's a few things that we want to add to this in terms of our mapping. And I know this mostly because I'm familiar with the location table, but we'll see that here in a bit when we actually start to look at it as well. So I know that the way that the Integration Hub ETL tool works is it has this concept of a source native key, which is very important for doing some lookups and associations. And what the source native key means is pretty much what it says. So it's from the source. So here's all of our source data, and it's a key that came from that source. So here we could potentially say, all right, well, there's this ID, looks like it's something that's from the source that represents an ID. So we could use that. For the state, I would say it's just going to be the state code. That seems easy enough. But for the city, maybe my source native key is this ID right here. And so there's a couple other things that I need to do which aren't in here, and really it's that the state type, or it's really that location type, which is those from the choice list. It's basically from this choice list, we effectively need to be able to set these as part of the mapping. And so the value I want to give it actually is that one for the state value. And so state. And when we apply that, then there we have it. We need to do the same thing for the city. We'll just do type and create type for city. And that one is pretty easy, it's just city. So one thing I actually want to do is create a different name for the city than just like Abbott. And it goes back to that problem where multiple states may have the same city name. And so I want a user to be able to easily just look at the name of the city and understand if it's the correct one or not. So I actually want to do city plus the state code. And so that will be my city's name value that I want. Here we can do city and state code, and I want to put a comma in between them. So there I've got Abbott, Texas, just like I want. And so with that, we can effectively mark this as complete for now. We'll look at how we can come back to that pretty easily. But now let's come into here and add class. So what I really want to do here, and this may not be as intuitive right away, but I want to add location twice, and we'll see why that is. So the first one is actually going to be for state. That's it. Second one is also going to be location, but this is going to be for city records. And so what I'm going to do on this one is say, all right, my source native key here is my state code. And my location type here is my name, this. And let's see if there's any other attributes I want to add for this. So here, if I want to, I can actually use the code value in this one and say, let's use my state code here as well, if you want it to be the short version of it. So the name is going to be Texas, and the state value is TX. It's of type state or province. So there's the state mapping. We do something similar here on the cities. And so for city, the source native key I want to use is this ID value. That's unique for a bunch of cities there. We're going to say the type is name. We created that concatenation. And let's add some other attributes in here. So obviously it's the city. Could do lifecycle stage and status. I don't really have in there right now, but we can take a look at that here in a second. State for these as well. And that's about all the data that I really have at this point in time. So city, I'm just going to use the city without the actual concatenation of the state. And then for state, again, we'll use the code value. So lifecycle stage and status, what does that really mean? So I could have probably had this open here. We'll take a look at our product documentation as it relates to lifecycle states here. So let's see, CSDM. All about CSDM. And let's understand what this really means. Climate groups, no, don't know about that. Let's go into these domains. So I know that locations are actually foundational data. And so here I see location, lifecycle. So what can I understand about this is that locations use this operational stage and an end of life stage, and then these different statuses. So what does that mean? Maybe I should look at operational and either in use or available. Those would seem to make sense for my integration here. And so I happen to know that those are actually just the actual values to set. And so let's see if we can go to cycle stage and status here. Mappings, no. maybe I can get to it from here. Legacy values. No, I don't think that's what it's going to be. Anyway, well, I'm just going to go ahead and set a couple values for that, because I think that they are operational. So that's the stage, and then my status is so I've got those. I'm just going to map those in here. The status is available, and the stage is along those lines. Maybe reference fields. We'll double check that when I come back to it, because I may have to provide the sysids of those, probably. One other thing on this association, and that I didn't do there, is I didn't actually add in the parent. So remember how one of our identification rules was is actually the fact that I can have more than one of the same thing in here. There is oh, actually I don't need it there. What you do is on this association, I'm going to actually say I want it to be associated with the state records. I feel like I actually should have parent value in here. One more time, and then we'll test it out. That's why we test things. All right, well, we will check and see if that actually ends up working. So mark that complete. Here we can actually, let's run this integration, see what it does. It says 2 new records will get created, and here they are, Texas. And then you see it actually did set my parent record to be Texas. So that's what I wanted it to do. If I look at these locations, I actually see that here. And you can see that it populates the parent reference with Texas. I want to actually roll that back. So let's take that out, because we're going to load the full data in. So, it's gone. So at this point, you can schedule it, but I don't want to schedule it because I'm going to push data into this. And so at this point now, I've got this all set up and ready to go. That's good. And we are ready to load in all of our Texas data. That's the example we're going to use. And so here, again, I've got a bunch of data about Texas in it. And we set up this particular endpoint to point to our data source import set table. And let's just send that in. Quite a few cities, so it might take it a little bit, but we should get a sysid of an import set at the end of this. So sure enough, there we go. So there's our import set ID. We can do a couple things to see if that's actually processed. So you can go look up the imports. Doesn't look like it's processed yet. It's just all say loaded. Newest one. Yeah, so here's our insert multiple. You can see to this REST endpoint, still just in a loaded state. Yeah, here it's running. Now it's complete. All right. So if we come back into locations, all these out. All right, so now I've got all these different ones that are all cities. Should be able to filter that out and just have the one record for Texas as the state. Even though each and every one of those cities had Texas in it, part of our identification rule is we only want one Texas as a state. So that's what it achieved for us there. So here we've done our import for these. You can continue to use it, continue to push one by one if you've got new cities that you need to have added in, and so on. So let's go back and take a look at what else we can do. So you can actually start to expand on that location use case and add other ETL definitions in for maybe streets or sites or some of the other location types that we have. Excuse me. If you've got multiple sources updating this, you can define some reconciliation rules to say certain sources maybe can't update the name or city or state value, but maybe they can update the latitude and longitude or some other attribute that's on the location record. Some other things we can do is import users, like we said. You need to decide, all right, is email a unique identifier? First and last name, usually not. Maybe there's some sort of universal ID that your company uses and is in multiple different sources. So really the first step of understanding what makes a user unique in your organization will be the first thing that drives the creation of that identification rule. And then beyond that, these are the other CSDM foundational data objects. So things like company, business unit, department. Maybe you want to create that hierarchy and have data sources to feed in that. So you can think about doing that. But at the end of the day, the process is very similar, and using the IRE and IH-ETL will allow you to streamline those imports and create a high quality set of foundational data. And with that, thank you for watching. Hope this helped, and good luck.